Hey everybody, it's Cameron. I'm going to show you this really cool family emulation plugin that I did a review for called Dehancer and stuff. Now in Dehancer, goodness, what was that for? Get out. Now with that absolute nonsense out of the way, if you don't know what Dehancer is, it's a film emulation plugin with not only a bunch of film look profiles to choose from, but also many options to be able to emulate film characteristics. So full disclaimer, because that's what YouTubers do, I mean, it's important. Dehancer did give me a license of Dehancer Pro in return for this review. However, they have no input on what I'm going to say about the plugin and the iPhone app, which I'll talk about near the end, which is something I find extremely important when creating reviews because it means I can be unbiased and objective as possible, because there are definitely amazing and not so amazing things about Dehancer. So let's jump into Resolve and take a look at those things. Now, just as a prerequisite, I am color managing in nodes. I'm working in DaVinci Wide Gamut, and I'm using a DCTL for my output transform, the JB2499 DRT. You can use a color space transform to get a very similar effect. I just like the control that this one has. And I've got multiple different types of cameras and different clips, ranging from C-Log 2 to C-Log 3 to D-Log from a DJI drone. I've got F-Log, I've got a straight Rec. 709 clip, and a S-Log 2 clip. And this is just to showcase Dehancer using the normal workflow that I would normally work in, especially when I'm working with multiple camera formats, which I often do. All right, so let's go ahead and add Dehancer. I'm going to start with this clip over here, and we'll just go into our Effects tab and scroll all the way down till we get to our Dehancer Pro here. I'm just going to apply it onto this clip, and right away, the one thing I just want to point out real quick is by default the grain is relatively aggressive, so I'm just going to scroll down to film grain and turn that off for now. We'll get to grain a little bit later. Now, the first thing I really appreciate about Dehancer is it gives you a number of working spaces to work in. So for me personally, like I said, I work in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, so we can go ahead and select that, and we're already in a good working space. They also have the option for Cineon Film Log. That's going straight to Rec. 709 using the Cineon Film Log curve. So you just use a color space transform afterwards, and you would just go from Cineon Film Log to whatever gamma you end up working in. And of course I would take off this DRT, but you get the idea. So we'll go ahead and delete that for now. And we're going to switch to DaVinci Wide Gamut here. Now, the one thing I did notice when testing this out is that going to certain clips, let's just take this one for example, it seems that certain profiles, or maybe all of them, tend to clamp values in certain cases. And most of the time this isn't an issue, but I will mention something later on where it actually becomes a factor, and why I think there's actually a specific limitation with this in general. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about that, but there is one effect that it does matter on, and why I think this one effect can probably not really be fixed, at least not natively with the way this is built currently. So let's go ahead back to our original clip here. I'm just going to bring this down so it's easier to see. But if we look at our profile options, obviously there's a significant amount of profiles that we can choose from, and they're obviously really great. I can choose any one of them, and they will likely give me the profile that I'm looking for, and it's going to look really good, and you can play with them and see what exactly they all do. Obviously, we're not going to be going into every single one of them. The only point of feedback I have for this specific part in general is I wish they were listed like they were on the site, because there's different types of film stocks that you can use. So some of them have black and white options. A lot of these are color negative film stocks, but some of them are for motion pictures. A lot of the Kodak Visions are examples of motion picture film stocks. And then we have color positive film stocks, black and white, which we just witnessed. And there's also instant films. And then there's some really exotic, interesting looking ones like Lomochrome. And if I bring the exposure compensation down, you'll kind of see what weird, interesting look that it's giving, which is intended, of course, but categorization would have made it easy to find the exact type of stock I was looking for, and makes it easier to sort through. But overall, I really like the selection, and the looks that it gives are very, very clean, and you can build a lot of your look development from most of these pretty easily, I would say. So we're going to just throw in the Fuji Color 100 right now for no particular reason other than that's the one I just arbitrarily chose. Now the push-pull correction is more of a exposure compensation that it's either correcting for overexposure or underexposure. So for example, if I bring sliders down, and this reacts differently depending on the film profile that you use, but generally speaking for all of them, a negative value is going to increase color contrast to compensate for underexposure, and a positive value is going to try to soften the image to protect highlights from overexposure. And just to showcase that difference here, there's a clear softening of highlights in Fuji Color 101 and then a increasing contrast when you bring it to negative values. But then when we look at something like let's just go with this one, there's a very much heavy shadow lift compensation when you bring it down to a negative value, as opposed to when you bring it up, there's just a little more of a subtle softening than you would get with a different profile. So it differs per profile, of course, but in general, that's the idea of what that push-pull is supposed to do. I'll go ahead and switch this back to Fuji Color 100. And I'll just go ahead and reset this as well, and we'll look at the film developer first. Now, the idea behind this tool is to create your own development recipe where you either don't want the standard color space transform and you want to interpret the footage differently, or you have some sort of log material but have no idea what the source camera or log profile is. Now, obviously, using a transform that was designed for that footage is always going to give you the best and most accurate results, but this is probably the best solution I've seen for unknown material. So we'll go ahead and turn this on, and just for hypothetical, we'll just say we don't know what this camera source is, so it'll just be a log profile right out of the gate, and we'll keep our DRT on just so we can see the results that we're going to get from trying to develop this on our own. So we'll go ahead and start with contrast boost, and contrast boost boosts contrast. That's what it does. And then gamma correction will just shift the midtones of the contrast either towards the shadows or towards the highlights. Color separation can really be viewed in two ways. One, it affects how much contrast changes the saturation. And two, it changes the intensity of highest saturation values. And color separation and gamma are based on contrast boost. So if there's no contrast, let's say that we just reset this, then gamma correction and color separation do absolutely nothing. But we'll go ahead and bring this up. And you can see those highest saturation values, once we bring color separation down, they start to become a little bit more tame. And if we bring color boost up, color boost is the overall boost in saturation using an additive model. However, the way that Dehancer has implemented color boost ensures that your colors are never going to go out of gamut, so it's a good safeguard to have. I still prefer the subtractive model of increasing saturation, but it's probably the best additive saturation model I've used. Now, of course, the image doesn't look quite fantastic right now, so I'm going to go ahead and just compensate for the exposure here using my exposure node. This is reducing exposure in linear here, so I'm just going to reduce it by about a stop so that we can have a little bit more of an accurate representation of what we should be seeing here. So maybe something like that is probably a little bit better of a representation of it. Now that I've got that dialed in, I don't know if I want to mess with my film compression. This will often compress your highlights and give you a little bit more smoother of a roll off, but it can also make your image look a little bit muddy and flat in your highlight range. But this is where you would adjust those. You can also increase your color density. It will make your higher saturated colors brought down in luminance and give you a little bit more of a dense look. So it's a subtle adjustment, but it can be useful. Now expand will just change your white point and black point. So if you reduce your white point, it's basically reducing the range at which your whites clip. So you can bring it down if you need a little bit more contrast, but you also risk clipping your colors if you end up doing that. But you can also push it down to kind of flatten it if you want to get a more subdued look. And changing color mode to Luma will just mean that you're preserving saturation so that regardless of wherever you move these values, your saturation will remain mostly the same unless of course you clip colors. And then we'll go down to print, and this is where you can basically change your film print look. We can go to our profile and choose one of these. I usually either prefer Fuji 3513 or a Kodak 2383. I'll go ahead and choose Kodak 2383 for now. And we can change our target white if we want to change what our whites actually look like. We can do any exposure and compensation with the print. We can change the tonal contrast and our color density. And we can also remove some saturation if we want to. So that's a quick overview of the actual film look aspect of it. One reason I really like how Dehancer works is because we are able to work in DaVinci Wide Gamut, I can save this as a shared node. And let's say I want to apply these looks across all of my different cameras here. I can save this as a shared node, which I've already done. And I just call it Dehancer, and I can go to any other clip, and all of those clips have the same exact look, and it doesn't matter which camera it is because I'm color managing them all to DaVinci Wide Gamut regardless of what their starting point is. Now obviously it's not like 100% perfect, but it's very, very close, and it gives a good uniformity, wow, of the look across your whole piece, especially if you're using multiple formats. So I'm going to go ahead and re-enable the log state for this just so it actually does look proper. I'm going to go ahead and remove the film developer because we don't need to use it because I've already gotten it correct. Go ahead and reduce the clips here. And then moving on to color head. This is just for your overall blue and yellow color shifts. It would help if I enabled it. Your overall blue and yellow shift, magenta green shifts, and your red and cyan shifts. Or you can gang them all together and shift them accordingly. And I'll just go ahead and reset those. And then your shadows, tone, midtones tone, and highlights tone, midtones tone. These will adjust the color temperature of each respective tone. So you can dial in what kind of highlight temp and midtone temp and shadow temp you want. This can also be a way to dial in some unique split toning if you wanted to. Now the preserve exposure parameter, this will basically be how much auto compensation you want. If you're shifting colors in a certain way, it'll auto adjust the other two color channels to compensate for the other one that you're moving. So as an example here, I'm just going to go ahead and reset these to make this easier to see. If I have preserve exposure at 100 and I move the blue channel up and down, you'll see that red and green auto compensate to keep the exposure the same. But if I have preserve exposure at 0 and I move the blue, then you'll see that the exposure changes quite a bit. If we add blue, it increases exposure. And if I bring blue down, it decreases exposure. So if you want exposure preservation, just keep this on and you'll see the exposure stays the same, roughly. And now let's get into some of the actual effects of the film emulation. So I'm going to go ahead and disable color head right now and just bring it up. And we're going to start with film grain real quick. Again, it's just a simple grain emulation. And by default, it is pretty high. I typically like to have just a little bit of grain if I do add it. But what's really nice, and this is going to be something that applies to every single effect, but if we choose a preset here, let's just say we go with 35mm ISO 5000. That would be a lot. ISO 500, we can actually go up to custom and it'll actually keep that preset setting. So this is exactly what this is dialed in for that specific preset. If we changed it to this one and we changed to custom, you'll see that the settings drastically change. So it's nice that if we want to just change one aspect of this effect, then we can just select that preset, go to custom, and let's just say we wanted to dial a different chroma value here. The rest of it is the same as the preset. We just changed that one value. So I think that's a nice to have. And again, for all of the effects that have a custom option, this is true. Okay, so for halation, I'm actually going to switch the clips that we're working on here. Now, this is where things can get a little weird and where that clamped values thing I mentioned earlier becomes much more prevalent. Now, while I do think the halation effect is very pleasant and pleasing and definitely is better than the Film Creator and especially the original Resolve halation effect, there's still one major flaw. And that comes down to its physical accuracy and why it's very obvious in some circumstances. Now, if you want more detail on this, I definitely recommend checking out this video by Jew Works. He actually does a very good demonstration of this problem. But to summarize it, halation happens in film when light hits a camera or anti-halation layer, and then it spreads back and bounces back to hit the red, green, and blue layers respectively, which is why red is the dominant color. Then when it hits the green, you get yellow, and then when it hits the blue, you have all three colors, and then it turns white. Now in a digital space, a computer has no way of knowing what the light physically looked like when the camera captured it. It only has the data that the camera captured to work off of. So a bright light in a piece of paper could look like it has the same brightness in your footage because you've hit your luminance limit. And it's definitely not true physically because we know that that light is a lot brighter than the piece of paper. Now we can actually fix this by working in linear gamma. Now if you've ever worked in linear, we can actually come very close to simulating physical space with it because linear is actually just what cameras capture. Cameras then convert the linear space to a video space so our monitors can make sense of it, show us what it's supposed to look like, all that good stuff. But if you capture in a log or a raw space, because you know what camera space it was shot in, you can essentially reverse engineer that process and simulate the data that was captured directly from the camera. The problem with Dehancer's halation is it doesn't have an option to work in linear, and if we try to force it using CSTs, and I recognize I'm going to give it the wrong information here, but let's just say I go ahead and add a color space transform in here, and I'll just do it in DaVinci Wide Gamma because that's the color space that it's currently in, and we'll just set it to linear right here. So if we do that, it's kind of ignoring and clamping the colors because there's not really a way for it to interpret all of the data. So we're just hard clipping, and then whenever we turn our halation on, we're not really getting the desired effect from it. Now, even removing this CST here and just working with how the halation was actually just built into it, we still don't really have, and I'm going to amplify this quite a bit just for the sake of example here and show where this is happening. With true halation, you're supposed to see it around really bright light sources, and the places that is becoming most prevalent are these bright areas in the image, but not necessarily where light sources are directly coming from. And we can see that there is something happening up in these areas, but it's definitely not much. Whereas a proper halation effect, I'm going to turn Dehancer off, and actually I'm going to turn it back on and just disable all of the tools real quick just to only turn the halation on just to show the difference here so we can really accentuate the issue. I'm going to go ahead and go into the gallery here, and I modified Jew's halation effect so it could work directly within DaVinci Wide Gamut. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring this in and throw it on here. I'm just going to disable that, throw it on, and remove that. So now when we look at the halation from a practicals perspective, also just going to reduce the exposure just so it's exposed how it's supposed to be here. But now if we look at a back and forth here, we can see that the halation that we're getting from the physically accurate halation here really shows up in these lights and actually gets the reflections in here a little bit somewhat on the glasses as well. Now I recognize that this effect isn't 100% perfect, and no film emulation is going to be ever 100% perfect. As we play it through, you might see some splotchiness here. But overall, the actual effect is doing what it's supposed to, as opposed to when I throw Dehancer on here, it just looks more like a glow around bright areas because it's not able to interpret the full linear space that these light sources are coming from. So while I think the halation effect does look pleasing and can be used, I'm not saying don't use this effect, but there's definitely a different type of use case for it than actual halation. Now with all that said, if we move on to the bloom, I actually do like how the bloom effect is implemented. So if we go ahead and enable this, it really just gives a little pop or softening of the edges around certain areas. And what's nice about this is it automatically has this thing called save lights implemented into the presets. And the save lights is to protect the highlights from clipping from the bloom itself. But if we wanted to get that kind of clipping effect, they actually allow us to modify that in the preset, so we can go ahead and custom. Again, this is the exact preset that we were just on. But if we turn this save lights down, you'll see that we can really make that bloom pop and whether or not we clip. It can be an artistic choice if we want, but the bloom can really give us a lot of different pops in a lot of different areas, especially for a theme like this, because this was a Christmas themed shoot. For a different clip, if we go to something like this, where we're looking at a warehouse, might not be the best place for it, but there's still potential for it to work. So we can go ahead, and I'm just going to balance this footage real quick, throw my vector scope on, and I'm just going to center the white balance here. Again, this is all using linear so that we can properly balance the footage. I recognize that chromatic adaptation is a thing. Please do not comment about it. Somebody's going to comment, and that's going to happen. But even with something like this, if we scroll down to the bloom and we can disable that, we can probably bring our save lights up quite a bit. Or we can just go back to our preset and see what kind of effect we want to get to this. And even with that, it's subtle, but this could actually feasibly work as an effect if we scroll through the clip here. I keep zooming in the wrong spot. But it's definitely something that can work in some instances. And with the halation effect, once again, if we enable this halation, it's somewhat getting it correct on some of the lights, but it's also adding a glow effect onto the other sources. Whereas if I added, I'm just going to bring this down here, and I'm just going to throw that halation effect back on. We can see that even in this instance, with the halation, we have a very different, even gives kind of like a red and somewhat yellowish tint to the whole image, which sometimes isn't really what we want either. But again, it's dependent on the taste. But that's enough with halation. And I'm just going to stick with this, turn halation off. And I'm going to turn on the profiles once again, so we actually have somewhat of a look in place. Now, these next few things I'm only going to touch on really quick because they're more of just the generic effects like film damage. It has all the little dirt and scratch effects. And I'll just, in case of YouTube's sake, I will go ahead and just really accentuate this just so you can see what it's doing here. Film damage, you can customize whatever kind of damage that you want to it. It's nice to have. I'm going to go ahead and disable that. And then film breath is just the change frame by frame of either the exposure or color. And just to show this drastically, we can increase all three of these things, and we can see frame by frame that all three, the contrast, the exposure, and the color are changing, and it can just give a nice analog feel if you want it. And we have gate weave, which is essentially the mechanical movement of a film reel going through a frame window, and you get those little micro jitters and stuff. And to demonstrate this a little bit better, I'm just going to move to this clip real quick. I'm going to showcase this a little bit more. Let's just turn it off first just to see what this clip looks like. It's just a standstill shot on a tripod. If we enable this, we can see we have those little micro jitters. And of course, we can customize the parameters as well if we need to. And then overscan is the characteristic of overscanning a film stock, and you get the outside of the frame, so you get some of those perforations of the frame. I'll see if I can bring those up a little bit more. So sometimes that can be a really fun style or effect to apply, and there's a number of different presets you can use. Overscan, cool feature. And then we have Vignette, and it's a vignette. What more can I say? And then we have these monitor features. Now, I will say I really like the addition of these monitor features where you can turn on false color or have clipping indication. If you are using this in a working space format like DaVinci Wide Gamut or ACES or anything else like that, you need to make a separate instance of Dehancer. So after your DRT, whatever that may be, so you can place it here, and then we're going to go ahead and add Dehancer back on. Again, I'll just disable all tools so it's not doing anything. Then we can turn false color on or clipping. Then we can actually see it accurately, because if we do it on the node before our DRT, then it's going to apply the DRT to those false color or other effects, and you won't get an accurate reading. So just something to note, but really cool features that they're here. And then in our output, this is just the total amount of impact that you want for the entirety of your Dehancer effect. Usually I like to keep this at 100 because if I'm doing an effect, I kind of want to dial it in here and not have to go back and forth with it. But that option is there if you want to. And we also have the LUT generator, where if you want to dial in a 33-point cube for on-set use, you can do that here. And the disable input transform is really only for if you're choosing a specific camera. It's not going to really apply if you're using the working space. So this won't do anything in that case. And then for options, we have the option to do either normal or high. And in terms of the actual math of the film conversions, there's very, very little difference, if any at all, between these two. It's really only for the spatial adjustments, like your bloom and halation and stuff, that will probably actually see a difference in the quality options. But that about sums up the tool, and overall we have a really, really solid plugin, and I am actually integrating it into my workflow on a regular basis now. And the fact that I can much easier use it with multiple cameras, and I put these three in here purposely because these are all three different cameras. And if we turn off our grades and stuff and we just look at all three of them, I'll just pull them all up simultaneously here. We can see that they all are very, very different in terms of their color renditions and their color bias. Lenses are all different. But when we apply Dehancer, we can already get a much closer rendition between the three of them. And all I really did was just convert them to the same working space, and everything else just kind of fell into place. And there's significantly less I have to do with it. So even when you're working with different camera brands, this tool not only gives you the look that you want in a lot of cases, but I can also just change this to a different film stock of any sort. And even with three completely different cameras, and this is a Rec 709 clip as well, they all look very reasonably like each other. Now, obviously, they're not perfectly accurate here. I probably have to do a little bit more work on the clip level, but the fact that we're already that close is fantastic. And Dehancer created an amazing plugin to be able to do that. And the fact that it's really easy to just see what effect is happening on all of these clips right away. More of a Resolve thing, but still, I just really like that this is here. And then really quick, just to showcase the app, what I love about this app, and I'll get to the pricing bit in a second, but I can incorporate pretty much everything that the plugin and Resolve features in this app, and I can select whatever camera I'm using and work from the source there, and I can get to a really good look almost immediately and have access to those same film stocks, all the same tools that you have in the full Resolve version. So it's amazing that I have this type of power on mobile. Now, I will say there is a subscription cost, and you probably know how I feel about subscriptions, so take that as it is. The tool itself is fantastic. I'm not super stoked that it is a subscription-based app, so that's that. But I have been using it, and it has been a really useful tool, especially when I'm out and about and I'm just shooting with my Blackmagic camera app, small prop there. I'm shooting Apple log, and I just pull it right into the Dehancer app. It automatically recognizes that it's log because of the metadata, and I can just quickly make a nice look and be done in a matter of seconds. Now, at the end of the day, do I recommend Dehancer? Well, based on other people's experience with it, especially my good buddy Darren Moston, who has been using it for quite some time, I do recommend it as a tool that can help save a lot of time and build consistent looks, especially across multiple cameras, and increasingly speeding up your workflow. Again, if you watch a lot of my content, you probably know that I am very much a workflow type of creator, and Dehancer definitely does that for what I need. Do I use it for every single project? No, but I do know people that do, Darren being one of them. So ultimately it comes down to, does it help your workflow? And it has dramatically sped up my workflow a lot more than I thought it would, especially because I already use a lot of different tools for color matching, especially stuff like DCTLs for tetrahedral interpolation and mononodes DCTLs, but Dehancer was a pleasant surprise for what I wanted to do. So if you do decide you want to pick it up, I have a promo code CAMTIM for 10% off all Dehancer products, but you can always download a trial first to try it out yourself, see how it feels, see if it fits your workflow. And if it does, that's great. If not, then that's also great. At the end of the day, I just want these videos to provide some sort of value to you, even if it was just for entertainment purposes. Some of you do that. That doesn't make sense to me. Whatever. But let me know what you thought of this review / tutorial / whatever you decide to call it. Leave a comment. can't do all the buttons pressing that and there's YouTube stuff that happens that YouTubers say. And speaking of YouTube stuff, it probably recommended a video over here or something. I don't know what it is, but you know, it's there if you want to watch it. It's a video, certainly is. But this is Camera Tim signing out. Up next, Dehancer Audiio. No, don't do that.